The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been granted special governing powers by his parliament, but globalists are claiming that such powers have turned Hungary into a de facto dictatorship. So we're going to take a look at the powers that have been granted to Prime Minister Orbán. We're going to see what's really happening in Hungary, and we're going to see what's really going on with the hysteria from the mainstream media. I think you'll find it very informative. Greetings, everyone. Dr. Steve here with you. Certainly hope you're all having a safe and sound, lovely lockdown Thursday. Before we get into the whole situation going on in Hungary, make sure to click on the link below and check out the video that we put together just for you on our brand new Turley Talks Insiders Club. I think you're going to absolutely love what we have to offer there, and you'll definitely want to be a part of this international fellowship of conservatives from all over the world who, like you, share a passion to see our conservative values triumph everywhere throughout all the nations of the world. I think you're going to absolutely love it. And finally, the coronavirus has turned your financial life upside down and you need help to sort out your choices to get you back on track, well, you should definitely talk to our good friends over at Noble Gold. Their team has helped hundreds of families through this crisis, and they can help you get back to safety and give you ideas on how to get there. So remember, when you need a financial friend, Noble Gold will always be there for you. So give them a call at 877-646-5347. That's 877-646-5347, or you could just hit the link down below and get their free investor's guide. Tell them Dr. Steve sent you. You'll be glad that you did. All right, let's dive right in here. The Hungarian parliament has granted extraordinary and highly controversial powers to the nationalist populist leader, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. The so-called Coronavirus Protection Law authorizes the Orbán government to take any and all measures deemed necessary to deal with the pandemic until the state of emergency is passed. Now, perhaps most controversially, this involves decretal powers by the prime minister. In other words, Orbán can respond to the virus by measures invoked by decree without parliamentary vote. It's what we would consider a kind of wartime power authorized for the prime minister. Now, you would think that given the threat of the virus, such a measure would be relatively straightforward. But the international outcry has accused Prime Minister Orbán of becoming a de facto dictator, claiming that Parliament has been suspended, as has any future elections. Now, we need to clarify that's silly. Now, these special powers that have been granted to Orbán are only as long as Parliament allows for them. Parliament has not been suspended. Why would Orbán suspend a Parliament where his own political party, Fidesz, has over 2/3 of the seats? They have a supermajority in the parliament. They own the parliament, for heaven's sake. And the parliament has the right to suspend these temporary powers that they've given to the prime minister whenever they want. So there are clear checks and balances still in place here. Nevertheless, the fact that Orbán has gotten so much power has caused consternation among our globalist elite. And there are even some who are going so far as to call for Hungary's expulsion from the EU, the European Union. So what sense should we make of all this? Well, obviously, there are two major things going on here. We've got the special decretal powers being given to the Prime Minister of Hungary, and we have the reaction to those powers by our globalist elite, most particularly the mainstream media. Let's take the media's response here first, that accuses Hungary of being a default dictatorship at this point. I think at one level, this is just part of the mainstream media's schizophrenia that appears to be a symptom of Trump derangement syndrome here at home. We have to remember that the mainstream media has up until this point seen Trump as the single greatest authoritarian threat to liberal democracy the world has ever seen. The Washington Post, in fact, adopted as its new byline, "Democracy dies in darkness," right? You perhaps remember their full-page ad that the Washington Post editors, they took out back in 2016 denouncing the possibility of a President Trump when he was just a candidate back then. And they declared that the prospects of President Trump represented the single greatest existential threat to the democratic traditions of our nation. And then when the virus hits, the mainstream media freaks out over the fact that President Trump has thus far refused to invoke the so-called wartime law, which is the Defense Production Act, to force manufacturers and industry to produce the resources needed needed to fight the coronavirus. Now, keep in mind, the wartime law is about as authoritarian as a president can get, just shy of all-out martial law. So for the last 3 years, the mainstream Marxist media has faulted the president for being an authoritarian. And then when the coronavirus outbreak happens, they fault him for not being authoritarian enough. And so it appears, at least to me, that we can now add schizophrenia to the growing list of TDS symptoms, Trump derangement syndrome symptoms, along with the more prevalent indicators such as temper tantrums, bedwetting, and a strange but sultry affection for Jim Acosta. But regardless, I do think the media is being a bit disingenuous here. Not only are they not accurately reporting the actual authority measures that have been granted to Viktor Orbán, who does have parliamentary oversight. Not only that, but if it suits their fancy, the media would have no problem excoriating Prime Minister Orban for not having enough power. This is precisely what they're doing with Jair Bolsonaro, the nationalist populist president of Brazil. The Washington Post has actually come out and called for Bolsonaro's impeachment because he refused to shut Brazil down. Bolsonaro is basically treating the coronavirus as a flu, for right or for wrong, and he doesn't see any need to shut the national economy down over it, similar to the way Taiwan has kept their economy going in the midst of this pandemic. So Orban is too authoritative, but Bolsonaro isn't authoritative enough. So I think we should just chalk up the response to the mainstream media and all this as little more than an extension of the incoherent hyperbole that characterizes Trump derangement syndrome. Now, in this case, we can think of it, I guess, we can think of it as nationalist populist derangement syndrome, right? If you're a good liberal globalist, you can basically do no wrong. But if you're a nationalist populist, and either you're too authoritarian or you're not authoritarian enough. All right. But having said that, what sense should we make of the new powers granted to Prime Minister Viktor Orban in combating this virus? And here I'm very appreciative of one of my dear classical education colleagues, Professor Chris Schlecht over at New St. Andrews College. He addressed something similar in a recent video. Now, of course, he's not dealing with Viktor Orban per se. He's actually dealing with the temporary closing down of churches in Idaho where he lives. And Chris is an historian, an excellent one. And he gave, I think, some really wonderful perspective on all this. He points out that there is a long tradition in the West involving government officials assuming extraordinary yet temporary power to meet a concomitantly extraordinary and indeed temporary crisis. History is a very useful guide here. There are times when the civil authority assumes extraordinary powers in response to extraordinary times. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. They assume powers that they don't normally have in order to meet a temporary crisis. Now, a great example of this, a relatively recent historical example of government officials assuming emergency powers, comes from World War II. Those of you who saw the movie Dunkirk will remember the Operation Dynamo, right? When British forces needed to be evacuated from Dunkirk across the English Channel lest they be wiped out. And so British admirals assumed charge of fishing vessels and merchant vessels and recreational vessels so as to get as many boats over to rescue the stranded soldiers. And this commandeering of commercial and recreational fishing vessels was an extraordinary authority, but Winston Churchill looked back and called it our finest hour. It was an extraordinary measure to respond to a comparably extraordinary, desperate occasion. The same thing is, again, my friend Chris points out, the same thing applies to forced curfew laws and forced blackout laws here in the United States during World War II. So after Pearl Harbor, there was a very real fear that the Japanese could attack us from the air. And so blackouts were forced upon whole populations, which was perfectly reasonable given the potential threat. So the important point here is that these are powers which governments are normally not allowed to wield, but given emergency situations, they may wield them temporarily in accordance with the nature and duration of the threat. Now, can these extraordinary powers be abused? Of course they can. But as St. Augustine said, you can never judge a philosophy by its abuse. Governments are indeed allowed to assume extraordinary powers temporarily in order to meet extraordinary times. It's a scope of authority and a scope of power that civil magistrates are not normally allowed to wield, right, in ordinary times, but extraordinary times call for such extraordinary measures. And so, and I'll link Chris's video down below for you for your reference. I think it's really, really good. So when we come to Hungary, we have to understand that polls show that the vast majority of Hungarians approve of their prime minister being invested with such extraordinary powers. They believe that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and Hungarians trust both their prime minister and the oversight of their parliament to meet this crisis responsibly. So we'll certainly be keeping our eyes on how things develop here, but I think as things stand, not only are liberal globalist denunciations of the Orban government inflated and hysterical, well, they're also historically irresponsible. Now, before you go, you will definitely want to check out my latest video I just uploaded on CNN's Jim Acosta getting destroyed by his media colleagues. I think it's going to make your day, so make sure to click on the link, and I'll see you over there. God bless.